You can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need. And sometimes you do get what you want, and it's bad. It sucks when that happens in video games, huh? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 games ruined by feedback. We're going to start off at number 10 with Dead Rising 4, a game that made some pretty drastic changes to the series formula that could have only come from player feedback. One of the defining features of the Dead Rising games, and one of the most controversial, was the in-game timer. In all the other Dead Rising games, you're constantly on the clock. Story events happen at a specific time, and if you're late, you're going to miss out. The story's cut short, and the only option you have is to start the entire thing over and try again. You know, you played Dead Rising, right? It's a system that adds a lot of tension to the game, which is a big ingredient in the secret sauce that is Dead Rising. You're always thinking about where you are and where you need to be at what time, which, depending on who you are, is going to be either an exciting challenge or a chilling reminder of the entropy of existence. I trend towards the former. It can be frustrating for people, but I like it. There are a lot of people who complain about the time limit in Dead Rising games, and it was a refrain that you'd see all over the place. Some people are not going to jive with what the series was doing, of course. So the developers, in all their wisdom, after 3 games, caved to the complaints and put out a Dead Rising game with no time limit whatsoever, and it stunk. The time aspect, it's just a fundamental part of the series. It's what makes it challenging and, more importantly, interesting. And without it, it's just another open-world zombie game with no real hook. The lack of the timer is hardly the only problem in Dead Rising 4. In almost every way, it seems like a much more generic, bland version of the series, made to appeal to a broader audience who was not interested in the series to begin with. The devs lacked confidence in the series' unique vision, and because of that, it tanked. The future the series could have had. I don't know, the remake was pretty well received, so maybe it can rise. Maybe the dead can rise.
Whoa, what's this?
At number 9 is Fuse, a clear-cut example of how focus testing can be really bad for a game. Fuse, a game developed by Insomniac and published by EA, it sucks. It's ugly, it's dull as dishwater. It's entirely lacking that whole Insomniac charm. Feels like work for hire or something. It's just so lacking in any discernible personality or appeal. It's easily the worst game to come out of the studio, but it wasn't always going to look like this. Before it became Fuse, the game was called Overstrike. It had a very cartoony art style and memorable characters in a vibrant world. It was Overwatch before Overwatch existed. According to an interview with the game's creative director, they brought in focus groups to see the game, and the response caused them to completely retool it into the much more generic Fuse. They primarily seemed to be responding to 12-year-old kids saying the game looked like it was for their little siblings. Like, the people they polled wanted darker and edgier. Preteens thought the game looked like it was for babies, so they took a promising-looking Overstrike and hazed it right up. Desaturated color palette, everything looks generic, the gameplay is all simple, it's just a boring gray sludge of a game. The takeaway here is, do not listen to literal children about game design. Yes, you are making the game for them, but they probably don't know what they're talking about. Nothing against kids, but like, come on, man. Feedback, it's useful for stuff like game mechanics or UI design, but completely redesigning your game because some kids were like, not only do I think this should be darker, but I also remember the last time I pissed the bed. It was nuts. The game flopped, and Insomniac reverted back to their old style for every other game after this, obviously to much more lucrative results. Moving on to number 8, it's Paper Mario Sticker Star. For a game that seems pretty innocuous, there's a lot of hatred for Sticker Star, a lot of which isn't necessarily the game's fault, or at least not the developers at Intelligent Systems' fault. Most of the blame for the game's problems should get aimed squarely at Nintendo and gaming legend Shigeru Miyamoto, and some player feedback they were apparently responding to. So to put this all into context, Paper Mario is a series of fan-favorite RPGs. The most popular being the second entry, Paper Mario and the Thousand-Year Door, which got a ton of praise for its amusing writing, its fun original characters, and its entertaining battle system. The follow-up to that game was Super Paper Mario, a wildly different experience that eliminated turn-based battles and cranked up the quirkiness to the max. The game got a much more mixed response, including an alleged fan survey where only 1% of players thought the story was interesting. Now, this sounds pretty dire, but it could have meant anything. It's very possible the responders maybe just found the story disappointing compared to Thousand Year Door, for instance. Maybe the story wasn't enough to justify the change in all of the mechanics of the game. There's been a whole lot of fan speculation about what exactly happened behind the scenes of this game, but we essentially know that Nintendo mandated most of the things that people really disliked about the game. They didn't allow any of the original characters from the developers, so all the fun personalities from the other Paper Mario games, they're just basically gone. The original version of Sticker Star was going to be a lot more like Thousand Year Door, but feedback from Miyamoto, which was influenced by player feedback from Super Paper Mario, forced them to completely change everything up. Basically said the new game was too much like the one that everybody likes. Throw that out and do something else. I mean, granted, he had numbers to back him up with that survey, but I mean, I feel like it was pretty disconnected from what people actually wanted out of Super Paper Mario, for that matter. So Sticker Star basically didn't have a chance. It was a series known for its personality and charm, and they basically told their developers to remove all that crap and make it more generic and boring. Yay! Moving on to number 7, it's Star Wars Galaxies. The story of this one's fascinating. It started life in 2003 as a sandbox experience, kind of weird. It's more about living your life in the Star Wars universe and being the gameplay-focused amusement park that most modern MMOs are doing, probably closer to Ultima Online, where you're grinding jobs, building up your house, collecting resources. It was, I don't know, to put it mildly, not the kind of game people really wanted a Star Wars MMO to be. The original version of the game was an interesting experiment, but it was a failure. They never managed to bring in the wide audience they really wanted, because the actual game, it was super niche. The players that did get into the game really liked it. There was nothing else quite like it out there on the market, so while the player base wasn't massive, they were passionate and dedicated. So when the developers started making drastic changes to the player experience based on the complaints of the many people who played the game for the trial period, got confused and quit, all they really managed to do was strip all the unique identity out of the game in the process. The much maligned combat update and the new game experience effectively derailed what the game used to be, completely changing the UI, making a lot of confusing and frustrating class alterations that completely upended the playstyle of current players. The entire classes were removed. It was much more of an emphasis on combat, meaning if you were playing as a non-combat class like a merchant, you were effectively screwed. One of the most interesting things about the original game was actually the Jedi class, which only a few lucky players on the server got a chance to play as. It was obtuse and extremely rare, but thematically it made sense with only a tiny few could actually, be a Jedi. Of course, more casual players complained because if it's a Star Wars game, they wanted to be a Jedi. So the developers just made Jedi another combat class, taking away one of the most interesting things about the original game's design. They tried to make the whole thing more like World of Warcraft, which is completely eating their lunch, but Star Wars Galaxies was its own beast, so their attempts to jam a WoW-shaped peg into a galaxy-shaped hole did not work. It was not a square hole situation, let's just say. They just took a game that was one way and tried to make it something it wasn't, to disastrous results. Here's one final example of how misguided and poorly planned these updates were. The game's third expansion included a special item that gave you a bonus creature handling bit of class experience, but just 1 week later they put out the new game experience update, and among other things, it just completely eliminated the creature handling job. The entire revamp of the game was really poorly handled. It was really inconsistent across the board. It's not shocking players ended up jumping ship. Moving on to number 6, it's WildStar. So this is a situation where a supportive and highly defensive group of hardcore players were sending ostensibly positive feedback to the developers, but they ended up creating this self-destructive feedback loop where all the criticism or negativity is pretty much ignored. Some games actually can be improved by listening to the right feedback, and that was the case with WildStar. Yeah, negative feedback can kill a game. A developer might try too hard to course correct, but with this one, the really, really defensive hardcore fan base prevented that from even being an option. So WildStar was sold as a throwback MMO. It's World of Warcraft, how you remember it, in 2004, but it was released in 2014. Now, it wasn't just a game for grumpy olds who wanted to relive the earlier days of older WoW. It had some innovative ideas like a real-time combat system that didn't rely so much on cooldowns, movement abilities like dashing and double jumps, and an entire quest branch focusing on exploration and discovering. I mean, it was a game that could have appealed to casual and hardcore hardcore players alike, but it quickly became clear that the hardcores were running the show. As far as I can tell, the developers only listened to the most toxic, try-hard segments of their audience, the pick-me's, if you will. They were the most dedicated players, but also the smallest and most insular. We're talking primarily about the people posting on the official forums. Sometimes the words don't come out, and sometimes the casual players also don't come out. Recovered from that one pretty well, right? The casual players rightfully complained the game was too hard. They criticized that it was a bit of a slog in some places. Like, these forum warriors, however, when they saw this, would shoot them down by saying that anyone who complains just sucks at the game, the difficulty's fine, blah, blah, blah. The raids were especially notorious for this type of thing. They were long, they were hard to get into, only one wrong move could lead to an entire raid party getting wiped out and being forced to start all over again. The game was trying to encourage old school raiding where players had to be doing 5-hour raids on a weekly basis, but most modern MMOs, they'd moved on from the poop socking mentality where you expect to play the game like a full-time job. Anyone who played, though, got chased out by the toxic community, and the developers were just listening to them, and only them, even though the player base kept shrinking. Difficulty wasn't the only problem with WildStar. It was buggy, it had a subscription model well past the point where most games had moved to free-to-play. Not that free-to-play doesn't have its own set of problems, but, I mean, it was just always going to be a niche thing. It didn't have the name value or marketing power of Blizzard, so it probably wasn't ever going to get, like, massively popular. But, oh man, was it a choice to only listen to hardcore players when you already had a fairly small player base. It's made it a minuscule player base. The game could have had a chance, but it squandered every opportunity. And number 5 is The Sims Online. It was meant to be a revolutionary game. Pre-release, it was seen as this grand social experiment. They were throwing around the term metaverse for a game that came out in the early 2000s. Pretty wow. Unfortunately, poor planning on EA's part and standard issue human behavior caused the sinking of the entire endeavor. How EA responded to feedback from the community was a central part of the failures of The Sims Online. Shocking, I know. The game had a reputation system where you could give green balloons and rate players positively. You could give them red ones to rate them negatively. The idea here was players would self-govern, upvoting the players who played by the rules and were polite and helpful, and downvoting troublemakers who griefed, acted like jerks, or were generally unhelpful. Sounds like a nice idea in theory, doesn't it? But of course, players found a way to exploit this system. I've read accounts from players who defend the reputation system as it was originally devised, saying it kept everybody in line, but the vast majority of players I've seen see it as an absolute failure where griefers use the reputation system to downvote people that they don't like to ruin their reputation. Essentially, a Sims mafia began to form where less than scrupulous players would unite to extort new players out of their in-game cash by threatening to systematically downvote them. A lot can be said about society based on this extremely failed experiment in social reputation profiling. We won't be saying it though. It would be too long and frankly very boring. But that system, it ruined the game. It's straight up a system for incorporating player feedback, and it ruined the game. It wasn't a great game to begin with. The gameplay was pretty repetitive and dull, mostly a chat room with some dull grinding tasks attached to it. But the way players behaved made it much, much worse. A lot of players went and complained to EA, but their response, they're EA. They don't know how to do anything right, basically. It seems like their developers have to sneak good games out, and then whatever the feedback is might ruin them. So instead of dumping the reputation system and bringing in, like moderators or some kind of adequate supervision to stop the blatant griefing, they waffled and sent threatening messages to players telling them not to use features that are in the game. I want to repeat that for you. They sent threatening messages to players telling them not to use features that are in the game. They eventually settled on the worst possible decision by making it so any player you raid has to consent to your raiding, which would freeze you in place until the other player clicked on a pop-up you asked to allow a stream. It's bad. It might have stopped a lot of the griefing through the reputation system, but in the process, they made the legitimate use of the system not possible. Nobody's going to consent to you giving them a bad rating because they've done something bad. Like they do bad things in the game. That person isn't like, I'm just going to play by the rules and accept my punishment. No, that's not how that works. Man, EA screwed up The Sims Online. It's so backwards. How are they like this? And number 4 is Deus Ex Invisible War. Little harder to pin this one down, because a lot of interviews from the creators of Deus Ex Invisible War vaguely allude to influences that ultimately led to Deus Ex, the sequel, just kind of sucking and being what most people considered a failed follow-up. There's not a lot of specific information to work with here, Warren Spector, in an interview with IGN, mentions them focus testing the game concept and getting back stuff like the game was set in a far future, put the guy in a purple jumpsuit. Pointless crap. But I think what he's trying to get at is there were too many voices in the room, too many cooks in the kitchen when it came to Invisible War, and it hurt the final product. The game's main designer, Harvey Smith, has said similar things, but is more vague about it, even more vague about it, in fact. Apparently, the designers were listening to other industry people pushing them to make these huge sweeping changes to the game to completely upend the setting, put in universal ammo, simplify a lot of the game's original systems. Part of this was because they were making the game for console, but a lot of the dumbing down was just part of the overall design of the game. They wanted to do something completely new, and in the process kind of forgot what made the original Deus Ex so great in the first place, right? They were so busy listening to focus groups telling them to make pointless changes, and industry insiders telling them to throw the baby out with the bathwater. All they had to do was make another Deus Ex, and everybody would have been really happy. But instead, they made something almost unrecognizable. On its own, it's not like a great game or anything, but it's not the worst thing. That said, the name Deus Ex leads to certain expectations, and wow, does Invisible War not fulfill them. To call something not a terrible game is not really high praise, you know? And number 3 is Paragon. One of the biggest challenges in making a multiplayer game is just staying consistent. There's a long line of failed MOBAs, battle royales, auto chesses, and card battlers that just didn't have the confidence to remain consistent in their game design. Paragon is a perfect example of a game like that. It struggled so hard to stay relevant, so Epic would make these massive sweeping changes to the entire experience. They'd frustrate current players and confuse new ones. It's one of those games where there was a solid core, and essentially it was Smite without the mythology gimmick and a few other twists on the usual MOBA formula. The game could have been relatively successful if they could ever decide what it was going to be. But it seems like the dev team was pretty constantly flailing, making mad swings in response to player feedback. They could just not decide if the game was primarily a MOBA or a brawler, and they'd make these massive changes in how the game worked, and I don't know, they'd hope to bring in new or lapsed players, and all they succeeded in doing was digging their own grave. They tried so hard to make a game they thought people would like that they made a game that nobody could enjoy. There was no solid ground to stand on when the earth was constantly shifting under your feet. The design is just all over the place, and that's a huge problem when you're trying to make a long-term multiplayer game that's meant to retain some kind of consistent player base. This is a very common issue among floundering multiplayer games. It happens seriously all the time, and it never works out. The real takeaway here is that balancing a game is hard, especially when there's a weird hybrid set of circumstances like Paragon. It's a weird game. The rare game manages to thread the needle, but everything else flails and, after a few months just sort of mercifully dies off. At number 2 is Dota Underlords. Anyone remember this one? It was originally a popular Dota 2 fan mode before becoming an official game mode. It was part of a fad of auto battlers that came out early access in February of 2020 and managed to last all in 9 months. They only got to November, folks, and when people say the thing was mostly just an off-ramp for Valve devs fleeing the trash fire that was Artifact, Valve's failed Hearthstone competitor, might be onto something. That might be what it was. Underlords is a game that had its fans, don't get me wrong, but from everything I've seen, it's pretty clear Valve didn't have a lot of confidence in what they were making. There are a lot of people saying that Valve was in the Steam forums and on Reddit taking every asinine piece of advice that was offered. And while I can't find any actual evidence of this, because the Reddit nor the official Steam forums neither go back that far, at least the wiki is still around as a monument to indecisive community-driven game design, and you can find enough evidence there, I think. Or at least illusions. The patch notes were littered with ill-fated design decisions like they'd make big sweeping changes to the meta and then they'd take them back almost immediately. Stuff like Jail, where they'd ban certain heroes on certain days. Maybe not bad ideas in theory, but not implemented well. For example, certain alliances became unusable when relevant heroes were jailed, and that'd break entire strategies. A lot of other features would come and go or get heavily reworked because Valve, they're just heavily soliciting advice from their own players. That's good, but you don't use all of it, okay? Being responsive to your player base, it's natural, it's good. I don't want to say it's bad, but they just didn't really know what they were making. There was not a lot of pride in the product, so instead they were just flailing, desperately seeking approval from Reddit randos and attempted to crowdsource their way to a game that people might want. And finally, at number 1 is New World. Amazon's ill-fated foray into gaming has just been one disaster after another. Remember Crucible? Yeah, me neither. I also don't remember Crucible. I remember the word Crucible and that it existed, but beyond that, And that's only because I looked into Amazon's ill-fated foray into gaming that has just been one disaster after another. I had forgotten. New World was supposed to be the next big MMO. It got a massive ad campaign and a whole lot of hype behind it. When it came out, it had the second biggest launch of all time on Steam, too. But the game they released was not the same one from the beta. The original version of the game was not perfect, but it did have some kind of vision. In beta, it was an open-world PvP survival game with some crafting, basically a large-scale medieval Rust. It may not be the game modern MMO players would have wanted, but a segment of the player base was really into it. So of course the studio folded to the people who complained about the beta and took a year to completely rework the entire game to be a more traditional quest-based MMO, and the results were a mess. Now, it was the worst of both worlds, a weird half-baked story game with a lot of vestigial survival game elements that were now rendered mostly pointless. The PvP went from the focus of the entire game to being completely optional. They still allowed people to engage in the open world PvP when the game, wasn't doing the other things, but there's almost no reason to do it. It's clear their passion lies in open world survival, not traditional MMO stuff, because those features were clearly half-baked and made by people who don't get them. There was and still is no PvE dungeon matchmaking, for example, a staple of even the most basic MMOs these days. New World was probably never going to be a massive success for Amazon, but it could have been a solid multiplayer survival game. So it's unfortunate they caved to player complaints and reworked the game from the ground up into something that it wasn't. They left the game that in every way feels like it's at war with itself. It's not working as either a survival game or an MMO. It's two halves of a game that don't come together as a complete whole. Fun, right? Anyway, that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter and book me on Cameo at Falcon a Hero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.